Everybody. In this video, we're going to talk about some of the models that you can use to help your students understand the process of adding and subtracting integers. So when you're adding and subtracting integers, there are some consistent patterns. And the best way to help your students understand these patterns is to give them some type of model that they can use for adding and subtracting integers. So the first model we're going to talk about is the number line model. So in the number line model, the first number in your addition or subtraction problem is going to be the starting point. Or in other words, like the distance away from zero that you're starting on your number line. Then if you're adding, you're going to imagine that you're facing the positive side of the number line. Or if you're subtracting, you're going to be facing the negative side of the number line. And then the second number is going to tell you the number of steps that you'll be taking in that direction. And if you have a negative number that you're adding, you'll be taking backward steps. So when you're doing this number line model for the first time, like if your students have never added or subtracted integers before, it may be a good idea to actually have them physically do this. Like you could have a tape measure that's taped to the floor or something like that, and have them actually walk out the process of adding and subtracting integers. So I'll go through a couple of examples to show you what that could look like. So if I wanted to show that negative 2 plus 3 equals 1, the way that I would do that is I would start off at the negative 2 mark on the number line. And since I'm adding 3, I'm going to be facing the positive direction. So my, like if you were having your students actually stand on the number line, they would stand facing in the positive direction of the number line. And then since we're adding a positive 3, that means I'm going to take 3 steps forward, which puts me at the positive number 1. And so that 1 is the answer to negative 2 plus 3. If I wanted to do 2 plus negative 3, what that would look like is I would start at the positive number 2. And since I'm adding, I would face the positive side of the number line. So I'd be facing positive. And since I'm adding a negative 3, that means that I'm going to take 3 steps backwards because a negative number of steps is going to basically be like backward steps. And that has me end up at negative 1. And so that shows that 2 plus negative 3 equals negative 1. If I wanted to show that negative 2 minus 3 equals negative 5, I would start at a negative 2. And since I'm subtracting, I'm going to be facing the negative direction. And since I'm subtracting a positive 3, that means I'm going to take 3 steps forward, which puts me at negative 5. But if I want to subtract a negative number, the way that I would do that is I would go to my starting point, which in this case is 2. And since I'm subtracting, I'm going to face the negative side of the number line. And the negative 3 tells me that I'm going to take 3 steps backwards from the direction that I'm facing, which shows me that 2 minus negative 3 is positive 5. And when you're introducing these concepts to your students, you can put them in the context of word problems so that it's not just adding and subtracting numbers, but they actually have some meaning attached to the problem. So we'll talk a little bit more in a second about the different types of word problems you could attach to these problems. But it's helpful for them to realize that number sentences like this are used to describe situations that could come up in their everyday life. So that's the basic idea of the number line model. And then the next model is actually my favorite model for showing the addition and subtraction of integers. And this is the idea of the set model. So in a set model, you use objects to represent the positives and the negatives, and any combination of a positive and negative object will make 0. So you can do this with a lot of different analogies. So you could have like ice cubes represent like negative numbers, and then like fireballs represent positive numbers if you want to. And the idea is that if you put a fireball with an ice cube, then that makes like a temperature of 0. Or you can also do like happy feelings and sad feelings, or whatever analogy you want to use, or you can just use the symbols of positives and negatives, and that totally works as well. So in the set model, we're going to think of addition as combining, and then we're going to think of subtraction as taking away. So if I wanted to add these two addition problems, the way that I would think about it is I would start off with a -3. So I'm just going to use negatives to represent those -3, or that number of -3. And then when I add 4, that means that I'm going to combine these three negatives with four positives because I'm adding a +4. And remember that a positive and negative pair ends up making 0. And so those three pairs are going to equal 0. And what I'm left with is one positive, which shows that -3 plus 4 equals 1. If I wanted to model this other addition problem where I have -5, so I have 5 negatives, and then I'm combining that with 2 negatives, well, in this picture model, it's easy to see that the answer should be -7, because if I take 5 negatives and I combine them with 2 negatives, then it just makes 7 negatives. If I look at a subtraction problem where I have 8 negatives, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 negatives, and I'm taking away 2 negatives, well, if I take these 2 negatives and take them away, the amount that I have left are 6 negatives. And so that shows that -8 minus a -2 equals -6. However, sometimes you might have numbers where you can't take them away. Like, for example, if you have 5 minus -1, well, I'm starting with 5 positives and I'm asked to take away one negative. Well, there is no negative in my picture right now. And so this is where you would need to take advantage of the fact that a positive and negative together makes 0, because the fact that they equal 0 means that I could add a positive and negative to my picture without changing the overall value of my picture, because this pair would equal 0 and 5 plus 0 is still just 0. But what this allows me to do is now I have a negative in my picture that I can take away. So I can take away this negative, and this shows that +5 minus a -1 equals +6, because this positive is no longer like paired with the negative once you take the negative away. And so you have 6 positives in the circle once you take away that negative. Um, so that's the idea of subtracting negatives. And this type of model is really helpful for helping students understand why subtracting a negative is the same thing as adding a positive. Because in order to subtract this negative, I had to include a pair of zeros. But when I take away that negative, I'm left with an extra positive that wasn't there in the first place. And so that can be a helpful model for helping students understand that concept. And just like with the number line model, it's helpful to assign these word problem, or sorry, these math facts to word problems. So some examples of different word problems you can do are word problems that involve debt and assets. So if you wanted to model, having like -8 minus -2, you could say like I have $8 of debt, and then someone else came along and paid off $2 of my debt. So they took away debts, $2 of debt, and that left me with $6 of debt. So you can use a debt and asset analogy. You can also do like cave diving and mountain climbing word problems, where climbing a mountain is going in like the positive direction, and diving into a cave is going in the negative direction. And then, like, ground level would be 0 in that case. And those types of problems are helpful to model with number lines because you basically just have like a vertical number line representing your positive and negative numbers. And when you're looking at subtraction, you can also use word problems where you're looking at the difference. So, say for example, you were comparing um, one person who had $3 and another person who had $2 of debt. One way that you can find the difference between these two people is with subtraction. Because if you say 3 minus -2, that's going to give you +5. And that tells you that the person with $3 has 5 more dollars than the person who has $2 of debt. Or vice versa, if you do -2 minus 3, you get -5 because that's saying that the person who has -$2 has $5 less than the person who has $3. Um, so those are some different word problems you can give your students to help them put negative numbers in context when they're adding and subtracting. And I hope that those two models are helpful for helping your students visualize the process of adding and subtracting integers.